And welcome back. 350 NYC's grassroots network is dedicated to addressing the urgent challenge of climate change and averting a climate catastrophe. By actively engaging with communities, policymakers, and other stakeholders, the organization works to raise awareness about the climate crisis, advocate for transformative solutions, and champion the cause of environmental justice. Joining me now to discuss more is the steering committee member of 350 NYC, Mark Dunlea. And Mark, thanks for being with us.
Well, thank you very much for having us on. We appreciate that.
Thank you, and we're glad to have you in a very important conversation to have. And when we look at the state of our climate right now, and particularly as we take a look at New York City, how would you assess things?
Pretty bad, unfortunately. And the Secretary General of the United Nations keeps on making that point that the world's governments, including New York City and New York State, are not moving fast enough to avoid climate collapse. What we did in Paris, I think 7, 8 years ago, was set a target of trying to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees centigrade. We actually passed that target in the last month. It goes up and down, but they do expect that sort of permanently we will hit that target within the next 4 to 5 years. And what we're seeing that is in extreme weather. Most recently in New York City, of course, the wildfires from Canada caused New York City to have the worst air quality in the entire world, um, worse than in Delhi, India. And so we're seeing more and more extreme weather occurring, more hurricanes, more wildfires, more heat waves. And the world governments are not moving fast enough to protect people. And of course, who are the principal victims of climate change? It's the poor and people of color, certainly here in the United States, but also particularly worldwide in the developing countries.
Yeah, stay with me here on the wildfires here, because as we talk about New York City and the wildfires, a lot of us were taken aback literally by the fact that something so far away could have such a great impact right here locally. How much did these wildfires set us back?
Uh, well, the problem is going to keep on occurring. I saw some statistic as to, how much they contributed to global warming, and it was pretty extreme. But I can't, say that particular, data point at the top of my head. However, this is the beginning of the wildfire season in Canada. So it's going to go on for most of the summer. And of course, we've seen that previously, particularly both in Australia, um, but also in California, where each year seems to be the worst wildfire season ever. And we actually do get some of the haze and smoke, from California here in the United States. And I just remember 4 or 5 years ago how the Swedish elections in Sweden really changed quite dramatically because the tundra up in the Arctic Circle, which is similar to what we're seeing in Canada, was on fire. And the amount of smoke that was coming into Sweden was so extreme that it really particularly forced people to vote for Green Party candidates, but for candidates in general who want to spend more time and resources trying to deal with climate change.
Yeah. When we talk about a climate catastrophe, how do you define a climate catastrophe for the average person who may not be so familiar?
Flooding. I, like many of us, was living in Brooklyn, Bed-Stuy during Hurricane Sandy, and the type of devastation we saw, like down in the Rockaways and other places along the coast were quite shocking. And at that point, I was running an anti-hunger group, which I did for 30 years, the Hunger Action Network of New York State. And what we particularly saw was that a lot of the public housing projects down in Brooklyn lost electricity for weeks, if not months, because where do we put public housing? We put it in areas that are floodplains, that are less attractive to real estate developers. And when the waters rose, because the generators, the heat and cooling systems were on the bottom floor, they shorted out. And many of these were high rises, 15, 20 stories, and so for weeks people had no elevators. And a lot of times, of course, low income people can be senior citizens or disabled. And surprisingly, it was really the Occupy Wall Street movement who, really led that relief effort. It was not the traditional nonprofits, but, they went in, into these housing projects and were willing to climb up to 15, 20 stories needed to deliver water and food. Heat waves. I think heat waves are actually the single largest source of death. I mean, actually, air pollution does, worldwide kill about 8 million people a year. And certainly you see, problems like asthma in the Bronx and other places where there's already also a lot of emissions from diesel and trucks. But heat waves make it more difficult to people to survive. And of course, it's expensive to operate air conditioners if you're living month to month to try to pay your bills. And not low income people don't always even have access to air conditioning. And then you worry about access to food. Storms will devastate crops, and there'll be 20-30% less food. And once again, it's low income people who will not be able to afford the spike in prices when supply goes down, prices go up.
Yeah. I want to get an opportunity to talk a little bit about the work that you're doing. If you're just joining us now, we're joined by Mark Dunlea, who's the steering committee member of 350 NYC. And for someone who may not be so familiar with 350 NYC, a lot of advocacy and awareness is done. So, Mark, take it away a little bit and let our viewers know a little bit about the organization.
Well, 350 is a national group, actually started by college students and Bill McKibben 11, 12 years ago. 350 New York City was one of the first local groups that started. And the reason why we called ourselves 350 was because scientists said that in order to avoid catastrophic climate change, we need to keep the carbon in the atmosphere below 350 parts per million. Last couple of years, it's been above 420. So not 350, but 420. And, we basically are working to try to speed up the transition to renewable energy, clean renewable energy, wind, solar, geothermal, energy efficiency, really insulate homes, heat pumps, geothermal in the homes. But, probably most importantly, we have to stop burning fossil fuels. And we've actually done, kind of an okay, job in reducing emissions from producing electricity. We need to do a lot better job. But the two biggest sources of emissions are actually transportation, cars, trucks, and buildings, heating and cooling the buildings. And they in New York State, both account for more than 30% of greenhouse gas emissions. That we've done a lot worse on. I will say New York City a couple of years ago passed probably one of the best climate laws in the country, if not the planet, and that was Local Law 97, which basically required the largest buildings, 25,000 square feet or above, to reduce emissions. And since they count, if you're like in a condo or a co-op and there's 20, 30, 40 units, they count that as one building. I only realized this recently because it actually includes a lot of the condos and co-ops, and it actually reduces emissions. It does stop, I think 224, that new buildings, particularly residences, are not to add basically gas hookups into the building, but it also requires existing buildings, the larger buildings, to begin to reduce emissions, trying to get about a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. Frankly, that's not enough, but it's a good start, and it's certainly better than most other cities, states, and countries are doing.
Yeah, talk to me about local government. Do you think they get the message pretty much when it comes to this issue of fossil fuel and really dealing with the environment? Are we really doing a better job, I should say?
We are doing a better job, but as the head of the United Nations is saying, we're not moving anywhere fast enough. And I will say one of the things that particularly 350 NYC did was to lead the campaign both at the New York City and then at the New York State level, and we were successful to get the public pension funds to divest from fossil fuels. More recently, not only 350 NYC, but a lot of the other climate groups have begun to focus on who is actually financing these fossil fuel companies. Even after Paris, the four big banks in New York City and the United States, in terms of financing fossil fuels, are Wells Fargo's, Bank of America, J.P. Morgan Chase, and Citibank. They've actually increased significantly the amount of capital investment in fossil fuel plants since the Paris Climate Accords. That is immoral. That is wrong. And so there's a major effort that groups are, saying to these banks, you have to stop that. You cannot be continuing to finance the destruction of the planet, and you need to really, begin to finance more, things like wind and solar, geothermal, battery storage.
Talk to me about some of the work that's being done legislatively. We wanted to talk a little bit about the new improved bottle bill and also the Packaging Reduction and Recycling Act.
Well, the bottle bill is 40 years old. I think 41. I was actually involved. I was one of the co-founders of NYPIRG back in 1973, New York Public Interest Research Group. We were, times have changed. A nickel back in 40 years ago, not worth as much as a nickel is today. So we were trying to get the state legislators to increase the bottle deposit to 10 cents, as other states have done. And also, sort of strangely, that the bottle bill never actually was based on the bottle itself, but rather what was in the bottle. So we started off with carbonated beverages, beer and soda. A couple of years ago, we were able to add on water, which is much bigger being sold in bottles than it were 40 years ago. But we also like to get it into liquor and wine and tea. Certainly the bottle bill has been the single most effective program in reducing waste. But that comes to the second bill. Some people know it as extended producer responsibility. But plastics have exploded across the planet in the last decades. And literally any place you go on the planet now, top of the mountains, you will find plastics there. And I was actually active in New York City, and we got New York City and then New York State to ban plastic bags. I will say it's not very well enforced in New York City as compared to the rest of the state. But we want to, within the next 10, 12 years, actually reduce the amount of single-use packaging. Amazon and other companies are doing by about 50%. And we also want to remove a lot of the very hazardous materials that are often put into the packaging, like formaldehyde. That bill did not pass, and it's sort of like a trifecta. What increasingly plastics is doing is being driven by the fossil fuel industry. As the world is saying, you have to stop burning fossil fuels. Increasingly, the fossil fuel industry is turning into making plastic out of fossil fuels. So you're going up against, the packaging industry. You're going against the fossil fuel industry. You're going up against Amazon, Coke, and it's very difficult. And I will say, since you're in the Bronx, I've been doing this for 50 years. In that 50 years, by far the single worst assembly speaker, particularly in environment, has been Carl Hasty, who's from the Bronx. And people need a lot of fire under Speaker Hasty. He's the head of the state assembly. He doesn't really listen very much to his members. Rank and file assembly members often aren't even allowed to talk to him. They got to go talk to his 25, 30-year-old staff, and a lot of them are very upset. And he's blocking a lot of important legislation. We saw the New York Heat Act pass the Senate this year, which would require banks to require utility companies to stop subsidizing the expansion of, like, putting in new gas lines and stuff like that. They also, the Senate passed the Climate Superfund Act, which would require the 30 largest polluters in the state emission-wise, many of them multinational oil companies, to actually pay about $3 billion a year to help deal with the need to remedy climate. He won't even allow the bills to come up for a vote. Last year, he did block the public power movement. He wouldn't allow the proposal to have the New York Power Authority to build more wind and solar to come up for a vote. This year, Governor Hochul did put it in the budget, and we were able to get a compromise, not as great as we want, but it's definitely a step in the right direction. But he also wouldn't allow the packaging bill to come up, the bottle bill to come up. We need people in the Bronx to be paying a whole lot more attention to what Speaker Hasty is doing, because it's still 3 men in the back room, even though now one of them is women. But Mr. Hasty is the man in the back room most blocking action on climate.
So why do you feel that Speaker Hasty has not responded in this regard, considering that it's something that possibly would benefit the community?
Campaign donations, the wealth of the fossil fuel industry, political power. When you go up to Albany, the state capitol, maybe you get 3, 4, 5 people, like me running around trying to protect the environment. Many of us are, volunteers not getting paid for it. Some of the environmental groups do have staff, but, basically on our side, we have 10 or 15, staff who lobby. On the other side, you got 300, 400, 500 staff of the various polluters. They're getting paid, $200, $300 an hour to be lobbyists. They go basically all night long. They go to campaign fundraisers, dole out money. They're spending tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to buy legislators. And as you may know, a couple of years ago, they finally agreed to a system like New York City has to partially fund public campaign financing in New York State for state legislators and state elected officials. And this year, the State Assembly at the last moment basically gutted that law, even though it had not yet gone into effect, and really made it more of an incumbent protection program. All the media, all the good government groups were outraged by what the legislature did on public campaign finance, and it didn't work. I mean, the question is, are we going to try to build a world that protects the wealth and the profits of the 1%, or are we going to try to build a world that is concerned about the well-being and the common good of the 99% of us? And in Albany, and frankly in New York City Council, too often the 1% carries the day.
Yeah. I want to get your perspective a little bit. We talk about what's going on locally. You talk about New York City. We've got a lot of buses out there, school buses. I think about right around the time that we actually taped the show that you got buses that are going to and fro. And the fact is that many of them are still diesel buses. When we look at diesel buses now across New York City, you got to ask yourself the question, how much progress are we making in this area? I think about diesel buses that sometimes we could see close to, highways and really entrenched in low-income neighborhoods, and the potential damaging effect that it could project realistically on communities if there's not some sort of change dealt with.
Well, you're absolutely right. I will say more money has been allocated, so we are going to be switching over to electric school buses. We need to switch all buses over to electric to electric vehicles. We need to improve mass transit. We need more faster buses, electric buses, in places which not being served by the subway system. It is shocking to me, while New York City has the MTA, the crown jewel of mass transit in the United States, the carbon footprint from transportation in New York City, rivals that of Los Angeles, with far less mass transit. We got to do a better job. People say maybe you should make the subways free to make it even easier for people, and certainly giving more subsidized cards to low-income people. But you're absolutely right, and these. Where you store the buses are often in low-income neighborhoods. They get the diesel emissions. They get, that's why we see a lot of asthma. And I will say, every time New York State has done a study of the negative health impacts in a lot of housing projects, they never say it's because of the local pollutant facilities next door. They never say it's because of the amount of trucks and buses that go by. They always say it's because low-income people smoke too much, drink too much alcohol. It's always private decisions. So we really need to, get a health department, health officials that are much more willing to be realistic about what are the problems that low-income people are facing. And of course, so many of the pollutant facilities are based in low-income neighborhoods. It's one of the few things that was in the budget, besides getting the New York State Power Authority to begin to build renewables. They also agreed with, I guess, 8 or 9 years to begin to shut down what are called the peaker plants. These are usually the most pollutant facilities, and we only allow them to run at the moment when the demand is highest in the hottest days of the summer when the air conditioner is running. And that just pours an enormous amount of pollution into the low-income neighborhoods. So at least, they're going to be finally shut down, but, it's still going to take 8 or 9 years. There are solutions out there. And I should point out that, these solutions, besides increasing public health and actually lowering utility costs for people, also is the road path to full employment and good paying jobs. And in fact, the biggest labor issue right now with the transition to renewable energy is how do we train enough workers to fill all the jobs that we're going to create. And it's mind-boggling to me that when you have a solution, it's going to improve health, lower electric bills, lower utility costs, and create good, decent paying jobs. We face such a fight, and that's just because of the power of the utilities and the fossil fuel industry, and frankly, sometimes even the unions. Unions can be very good on some of these issues, but sometimes they can be more concerned about maintaining jobs for some of the workers in the gas pipeline issue. And that's why a lot of us talk about a just transition, that we got to make sure that the workers who are now dependent upon fossil fuels are in fact guaranteed that their standard of living is going to continue. And for instance, if they're laid off because we're shutting down a fossil fuel plant, that the government should guarantee their wages for at least 5 years and provide the training and make sure they're at the front of the line to get the new jobs being created.
Yeah.
Mark, and we got to fund environmental justice communities, of course. I should want to say that.
Yeah. Well, I want to continue that conversation about environmental justice for just a few seconds because when we look at what's going on right now, you mentioned NYPIRG, New York Public Interest Research Group, and I don't want to date myself and let you know how long I've been sitting in this chair, but I go back when we were doing interviews with NYPIRG just like we're doing right now with you, talking a little bit about environmental justice back then, and to look at where we are today, still having this conversation really is kind of jarring, but at the same time, very necessary. So when we're talking about the work of what's going on out there, what are some of the things that maybe the general public right now should be keeping their eye on, should be raising their voice on right here in the New York City area if we're going to have some sort of environmental impact?
Well, one good thing is there's been a lot of support, especially on the Democrats, to invest new climate funds into environmental justice communities. And New York has an official goal of 35% of new climate funds going into such communities. The problem is they're not putting any money on the table, so 35% of zero, unfortunately, is still zero. And, there's a lot of loopholes that they allow into the law. So I think we need to make them deliver on that promises. One good bill, a group called We Act up in Harlem, helped pass a couple of years ago, is that when you're giving permits now for new pollutant facilities, you shouldn't give them at all, but that when you do that, you need to now look at not only the pollution that's going to be created by that new facility, but also how much pollution is already there from existing facilities, and that may be a sufficient cause to deny the permit for the new facilities. And we have to make money available, particularly to low and moderate income people, to afford that transition. In my house, we put in air heat pumps. We had to shell out $10,000. We were able to afford that. 50% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. They can't afford that $10,000 to put in, a new air heat pump system. So that has to be subsidized. Yeah. And we need to really start shutting down these, pollutant facilities. And they are located in low-income communities. And we talk about plastics. plastics are being made in Cancer Alley, down there in Texas and Mississippi and Louisiana. We're always putting the pollutant facilities in the low-income neighborhoods because they don't have the political clout to say no.
Right. I got to get your thought before we wrap up about congestion pricing. A lot of New Yorkers are, saying, listen, this is a good thing. You have a lot of people saying this is not going to work whatsoever. But talk to us about the pros and cons you think of congestion pricing.
Well, we've certainly been a strong supporter of congestion pricing. We're disappointed it's taken so long to implement it. It does seem every few years we're told that the thing finally has a green light, and actually getting it to be implemented, of course, is a different thing. But hopefully it's going to be coming soon. And part of the problem is it's that the drivers coming in from Westchester, Long Island, New Jersey, who are more affluent, they don't want to pay the extra cost. But we need to get the cars out of our city. We need to make the mass transit system work more effectively. In the rest of the state, I always say we shouldn't say that we have a mass transit system that is comparable to a third world country, because why insult third world countries? They actually have much better mass transit systems than most of the United States does. We need to make mass transit not only affordable, but quick. In a lot of places it doesn't go where people live, and it doesn't go to where jobs are. So much of the mass transit, especially buses, takes people in from the suburbs, bring them to downtown, and then pulls them back to the suburb at night. But 80% of the people, that's not their work travel pattern. And we need to stop putting money into cars. We need to start putting much more money into mass transit. Congestion pricing, encouraging people not to use the cars as much is really important. And New York City is going to be a leader in that. It's disappointing it's taken so long to get it off the road, but hopefully in the next year or two we'll finally see it implemented.
Yeah, Mark Dunlea, we got to leave it there, but you've been doing a great job in terms of giving us some information to pay attention to, and a lot that's literally on the table, but we certainly are glad to have you, a steering committee member of 350 NYC. Before we go, Mark, please tell people how they can get in touch with you and your organization.
Well, they can all come and visit at a massive rally on September 17th when the the United Nations having a big march, or we're going to have a march for their climate meeting. But 350nyc.org, we get the New York City group. 350.org gets you to the national 350 group. And we're also on Facebook and all over social media.
Absolutely. Well, good to see you. Good to have you. And thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Darren.
All righty. We have to take a quick break. We'll be right back after this.